Okay, so we'll get started. So welcome to our webinar. This is called A Roadmap for System Change, Knowledge Transfer Tools for Learning, Collaboration, and Growth of the Community Housing Sector. So if that's what you signed up for, you're in the right place. This is put on by the Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative and the Community Housing Transformation Center. So without further ado, we're going to get started.
Great. Yeah, so Tristan, Siebert, and I are on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. The lands are unceded, and we want to make sure that we keep the folks who these lands belong to in the center of our minds while we do our work today. And if you guys are calling in from other parts of Turtle Island, just take a second to recognize the original landholders wherever you are.
Thanks, Brian. So these are your speakers today. I think on the initial event, it says it's just me. So sorry if this is a surprise to you, but I am thrilled that I'm not doing this alone. So I'll start. My name is Siebert, and I was hired by the SRO Collaborative a year ago, just over a year ago, to support with their evaluation and knowledge transfer work. So I'm an evaluation and knowledge transfer consultant. Thanks. Brian or Tristan, one of you want to go?
Yeah. I'm Brian Jacobs, SROC program coordinator. And I run the I work with the double O's, which I'm sure we'll get into.
And my name is Tristan Markle. I work with the SROC on the admin team, working on developing funding and programs.
And we're going to get started. So the purpose of the webinar today is really to share the SRO Collaborative's approach to participatory and developmental evaluation and knowledge transfer. It's also to explore evaluation and knowledge transfer as a tool for community-led system change. So whatever your role is in this space, whether you're interested in tenant-led organizing or you're interested in evaluation or in funding housing programs, there's probably going to be something you can learn from this. And we're excited to share this with you today. So we'll start with, for those who don't know anything about what the SRO Collaborative is or the program that we run, we'll do an overview of the SRO Collaborative, which is located in the downtown east side neighborhood of Vancouver. We'll talk about what that is and the work that we do. And then we'll go into the evaluation of one of these key programs at the SRO Collaborative. After that, we'll talk about a knowledge transfer process that we did following the evaluation. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion with all of you, hopefully. So to start, we actually thought we would ask a few questions of the audience. Thanks, Lee, for putting that up. So if you are interested and able to, please go ahead and fill out these questions. Make it quick, doesn't have to be that thoughtful, just so we can get a sense of who's all in the room. I'll just read them out loud as we go. So the first one is, how familiar are you with the SRO Collaborative? 0 is, I've never heard of this before. 10 is, I work with them. Number 2 is, did you attend the first webinar that we did, which was 2 weeks ago? It was called Organizing for Tenant Power. Nice, some overlap. And then the third one is, how would you best describe your current professional role? I've kind of made these buckets here. It could be that you're none of the above, and that's totally okay. Wonderful, cool. This is helpful, actually. So for the first question, a mix of people, quite a few know something about the collaborative, but not a lot. Some people have never heard of it before, so that's good. We'll definitely give you all the context you need. And interesting, yeah. So in terms of people's role in the room, several tenant-related organizations, that's great to see. And then some housing-related nonprofits, and one housing policy decision maker. And some none of the above. Sorry, I didn't have appropriate roles for you. This is great. Okay, I think we can stop that one, Lee, if you want to close it. Maybe I can. Lee, can you close the poll? Is that possible?
I thought it was closed. Is it not?
Oh, it's closed for
still?
you all.
Okay.
It's still open for me. Give me 1 second here. Okay, I think we're good. Great. Okay, thanks everyone. So this is going to start us off with this first section.
So yeah, for those of you who were in 0 to 5, hopefully this will provide some background on the setting of the project and evaluation. It's in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and specifically in SRO hotels, which will explain what they are. And our organization, the SRO Collaborative, and a little bit about the program that was evaluated. So in this slide, just a background on what an SRO is and the downtown east side. So an SRO is a single room accommodation building or hotel. They were built in Vancouver, mostly in the early 1900s for singles. The average building was built in 1911. They're originally built for seasonal resource workers. And they've, even though the demographics have evolved over the last 100+ years, they've always served as low rent housing. In terms of the units, the typical unit is about 10 feet by 10 feet, very small. And they, as a rule, do not have a in-suite bathroom or kitchen. There are shared bathrooms, and sometimes there's no kitchens at all. And in Vancouver, there are 7,500 SRO units, which is about 10% of the purpose-built housing stock. It is significant. And it's over half of the households in the neighborhood. And that includes all the parts of the downtown east side, so Strathcona, Gastown, Chinatown. It's over half of the households. In terms of the tenants, some key demographics are about a third of the tenants, according to a large survey that the SRO Collaborative did, and Brian played a big role. 1/3 were Indigenous, as compared to 2% citywide. Over 85% of the tenants are income assistance recipients, and all of them face multiple barriers to accessing the traditional housing market, obviously including high rents, but also other forms of discrimination. And on the right of the slide, about the downtown east side, if you live in Vancouver, you'll be very familiar. But for those who aren't, it's downtown, just east of the downtown core, and includes the tourist district, Gastown, the historic district, and Chinatown, and Strathcona neighborhoods. People may have heard it referred to as the poorest postal code in Canada, although that's a little bit complicated by the fact that half of the households live in SROs, and those are often traditionally excluded from census data because it's so difficult to collect data. So it could be even more so. That said, there's a long history of community organizing in the downtown east side, and of people volunteering for social justice and to help each other. And there's a long history of policy innovation. And one thing that's important to us is that SRO tenants have been historically excluded from decision-making around housing and neighborhood planning. And we believe that they are the experts. So that's part of the difference in our approach. Next slide. So the problem that the SRO Hub project is seeking to help to address is really problems for SRO tenants. They face severe risk of homelessness. There are 4,000 tenants living in privately owned SROs. Their housing is extremely precarious. For example, the turnover rate in privately owned SROs is between 40 and 50% per year, according to City of Vancouver stats, and other studies found similar numbers. And that compares to 10 to 15% turnover rate per year citywide. So it's 3 times more chance of losing your housing if you're an SRO tenant. Also, in terms of precariousness, the largest study on SRO tenants to date, it was done in 2008, it was a massive study, found that more than 50% of SRO tenants that year had experienced some form of homelessness in the previous 12 months, whether having to go to a shelter or tenting or couch surfing. Really, the number was over 70%, but you can safely say it's a majority of tenants face turnover and as a result face what we'd categorize as some form of homelessness. So why is there this turnover and precarity? It says on the slide, gentrification and real estate speculation, but to put some numbers on that, the rents were historically set at the shelter rate, which was $275 before 2008, and it's been $375 since 2008. But now the average rent in privately owned SROs is around $600. Luckily, the shelter rate is increasing to $500 this year, so that's great. Landlords can increase the rent as much as they want in BC when a tenant moves. That's an incentive to facilitate turnover and change the tenant population profile toward, for example, oftentimes students. Investors buy up buildings, and they're doing it right now. And they've been doing it for the last 20 years. They make minor repairs and then charge $1,000 a room, $1,200 a room, and now $1,800 a room, which income assistance recipients cannot afford. And finally, there's no alternative housing options. So tenants in those buildings where there's been speculative investment have few options, as the homelessness and precarity data show. So last thing to mention there, the third bullet is around inhumane and unsafe building conditions. If you live in Vancouver, it's well known that SROs may have terrible conditions, but what's less well known, and what I think the tenants have helped to educate people around through this project and projects like it, is that there are a range of conditions in SROs. Almost all of them are insufficient. Some provide accommodation that is much better than the streets or emergency shelters. Many, as you may have seen on the news, are in unacceptable states of neglect and chaos. And the main reason for this is not because the rents are low or not. The owners oftentimes make even greater profits than in the rest of the private rental sector. The main reason for the neglect of the housing conditions is that the tenants in the worst buildings are too scared to ask for repairs or improvements. And repairs and improvements are generally made on a complaint-based system. And SRO tenants are under very real fear of eviction. We've seen the turnover rate is over 40%. So if you're a tenant now, mathematically think of when you ask for repair, you feel, oh, should I? But they have 3 times more threat of eviction than the average tenant, who's already feeling that concern. So next slide. So this is my last slide, and then we can move into the evaluation. The SROC stands for the SRO Collaborative, or the Downtown East Side SRO Collaborative, and hopefully those acronyms are starting to make a little bit of sense. It's the neighborhood and the type of housing that we're focused on. And the collaborative was established in 2015 to advocate specifically for the tenants living in the 4,000 privately owned SRO hotels. There's 3,500 tenants living in now government-owned buildings. We don't focus on those. And the reason is there were no organizations advocating for the tenants in privately owned SROs. We began by organizing tenants to push for building improvements using existing bylaws and regulations. But even when the bylaws were enforced, there were unintended consequences, including mass building closures. So the conclusion was that the laws and the regulations, while they look good on paper, they do not protect the most vulnerable tenants in reality because the tenants have no power. So we adjusted our approach, which is part of this project, toward trying to help tenants work together to build up their collective power, which includes things like creating programs and structures and institutions to help each other and to share their voices with government, landlords, and community partners. And in conclusion, I might shed some light on the SROC's mission statement, which is there on the slide. Working to improve building conditions, affordability, health, sense of safety, and sense of belonging for tenants living in privately owned SRO buildings. Okay, next slide.
Great. So now we're going to get into the actual hub program, which is what CBRIT evaluated. So the hub program is a very intentional method of trying to layer all of our tenant-based initiatives into 8 buildings that we identified as having tenant leaders that we've already identified and were pretty developed as far as their organizing was going. So the goals of the hub program were to prevent evictions and homelessness, obviously to try to slow down that rate of change and that turnover that Tristan was talking about, to try and improve habitability, affordability, health, sense of safety. So that just comes directly from our mission statement. And then to create a new sector-based response around the future of the privately owned SRO hotels. So that's to consider the SROs, the privately owned SROs as a sector. And the idea of sector-based organizing is something that we learned from our friends in the labor movement and how they do bargaining there. So again, like the hub program, the 8 buildings we chose have various different sizes, and they have a lot of different profiles of tenants. Some of them are mainly older drinkers. Some of them are a little bit more dynamic and have higher, more drug use or more other mental health issues. So we were trying to see a variety of different buildings to try and figure out if our program could be adapted for all of those types of situations. Next slide. Cool. So the tenant-based initiatives really started off with our harm reduction program before COVID. So Toro, Tenant Overdose Response Organizers, they started in response to the overdose crisis, which predated the COVID crisis, always crises that we're responding to. But so they came up with the model of identifying a lead tenant to distribute and train their neighbors to respond to the overdose crisis with Narcan and clean supplies and all of those kinds of harm reduction techniques. Through COVID, we expanded and adapted that idea of the tenant leaders doing delivery in their building to food and to repair, which is bolts. We did education, which is our SRO degree. I work with the double O's who do organizing and mobilization. So if there's a community event, they're the ones that let their neighbors know about it. They also do referrals to community resources. So if one of their neighbors has an issue that they don't know how to deal with, they have a little resource book that they'll make a phone call or they'll walk them to the organization that can help them out. We also have an elder on staff who tries to reach out to Indigenous tenants and provide them with cultural supports. We've also got a Chinatown program, so we're trying to see if we can adapt these programs to make them culturally appropriate for folks in different communities. Yeah, and so the tenant-based initiatives are key to the hub program because they help us layer in our services. And the interesting thing is that the tenant-based initiatives are delivered through the tenants. So the landlords do not do the service delivery, and in some cases, the landlords would prefer us not to be doing our work in their buildings. Yeah, great. Mine too, yeah. So the tenant decision making. So the idea here is that the tenant-based initiatives provide leadership opportunities for tenants, and we are able to train them and onboard them as leaders in their building. And we want to try to have the tenants be able to have more control over the way that the services are delivered in their buildings. So we have a lot of opportunities for tenants to meet their neighbors through barbecues and community dinners. And they've done some small advocacy campaigns to try and get like laundry facilities. There's a letter up on the screen right now that we wrote to a landlord to encourage them to install laundry in a building where the laundromat had closed down nearby. So tenants were having to take the bus in order to do their laundry, and some older people in the building, that was just too much for them. So conditions were deteriorating because of that. We've also had lots of opportunities for tenants to meet with elected officials at City Hall and be able to advocate for policy change that would help them in their buildings. So there's lots of different opportunities around that, and we're hoping to try to expand that and formalize that further in the future. Yeah. Siebert, you're on mute.
Thank you. So Brian just gave a really good overview of the hub program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, starting with those tenant-based initiatives, layering those into key buildings with tenant leaders, and then trying to support more tenant power in those buildings. But something else that's worth mentioning as we're talking about the SROC and the hub program is SROC's role as a sector coordinator and really working as that actor that's supporting broader system change across the SRO sector. So I'll just share a few examples here. Some of this is from the evaluation, but some of this is also from before. So really, we've learned that the SROC has actually changed the flow of resources and information in the sector. So City of Vancouver staff, for example, have said that they have better understandings of the tenants in some of the buildings and what the needs are. And also it's helped create a flow of funding from City of Vancouver and other funders to tenants directly to support them. SROC has also influenced policy decision-making. Brian mentioned partly some of that. So tenants speaking at City Hall, SROC has helped make those connections between tenants and policymakers. So for example, vacancy control bylaw was happening in Vancouver, I guess almost 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago. And so tenants spoke at City Hall about that, and that influenced the policy for sure. It got passed initially. So third, SROC has helped change practices among government and landlords. One example I can think of off the top of my head is some landlords now connect directly with the SROC when they're about to evict a tenant or when there might be a tenant eviction. So SROC can help step in and support that tenant or identify alternative housing for that tenant. The fourth thing is that the SROC has helped shift the power dynamics in this sector in general. So up until now, voices of SRO tenants were often not included in these in resource and policy decisions. And we're seeing more and more some of that shift through the work that the SROC does. And finally, just changing the way the system looks at tenants. So not solely as social service recipients, but actually as agents and actors in policy and decision-making about their homes and their community. So that's great. So that concludes sort of the overview of the program. Now, hopefully you have somewhat a decent understanding of how it operates. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the evaluation that we conducted.
Many of you will have done evaluations or been involved in them. There's different approaches. So we'll tell you about our approach, and I'll just quickly tell you about what we're thinking at the beginning when we're starting it. So why did we decide to do an evaluation at this stage? And what were we hoping to achieve? The original idea of the SRO Hub project was that it was a system change project. We had a grant from the Vancouver Foundation, and we were thinking we're helping to innovate and develop a new tenant-centered housing model. What does that mean? There are aspects of that, as far as we knew, that were novel and could be difficult to explain by analogy. For example, we couldn't necessarily point to other organizations doing exactly the same thing. So how do we tell that story? For example, the tenant-based initiatives that Brian was talking about may not be the same as traditional service provision, and in some cases not even the same as traditional peer work carried out by tenant workers, by peer workers. So we want to explore that uniqueness and the implications of that and how to communicate how the model is different. Also, as Brian mentioned, the SRC was running multiple tenant-based initiatives. So there could be a temptation internally and externally to look at these programs as simply just so many services being delivered. But the idea was that the tenant-centeredness and the organizing for tenant power were the essence of all of these initiatives. So we want to explore through the evaluation how these different initiatives fit together, how they could fit together in these 8 pilot buildings, and to tell the story of what emerged as they fit together, like their emergent properties, so to speak. And system change, as was mentioned by Sibrit there, it also means that the larger ecosystem of institutions in and around the SROs begin to change. The SROs don't exist in a vacuum. People and institutions who have very little direct knowledge of the challenges and opportunities relating to SROs have been historically quick to make decisions about SROs without asking tenants. So we want to evaluate to what extent was tenant-centered housing organizing creating greater understanding among governments, community partners, the tenants themselves, our staff about what was really happening, and to tell the story of, is that changing? And in terms of our approach, developmental participatory, we hope that the SRC staff and tenants and community partners could talk about in a safe setting, supported by an external organizer, Siebert was a consultant, how the SRO Hub project was going in the middle of the project, and what was working, what wasn't, what made sense, what didn't make any sense. And I'll just say one key thing, one really impressive thing was the tenant evaluation committee that met monthly throughout this whole process. So that's a good example of what this looked like. And the 3 questions that were guiding Sibrit through this, I don't know, do you want to read them, Sibrit?
You can go for it.
Were, are we achieving our goals? Are we seeing increased tenant participation decision-making, and are we contributing to system change in the sector? Next slide.
That's great. Thanks, Tristan. So I'll dive in a little bit more in the next few slides to the evaluation and how it was conducted and the findings, some of the findings. So as Tristan mentioned, the overall approach was developmental and participatory, but I'm going to share a few notes and context here about the specific approach that we used over the past year. So a key part of it was storytelling, as Tristan mentioned. So to me, as an evaluator, I do think that evaluation is about storytelling. It's about telling the story of how something is going for some particular group of people. So it was really important that we did that storytelling in a good way. So relationships and trust was really key, probably the most key ingredient to having a successful evaluation in this community. So like Tristan said, part of that was having a tenant evaluation committee established with the support of Brian and others. We set that up towards the beginning of last year. And that group met monthly. And that was some of the lead tenants across the buildings, so that I could hear from them directly on an ongoing basis about their stories, about how the program was going. The next thing I'll mention is just amplification. What I mean by that is a good evaluation, I think, in this kind of context can really amplify and support the existing structures and organizing methods of the organization. So I worked quite closely with Brian and some other staff to really kind of like fit into their workflows, and like if they had events that were coming up, I would come and help mobilize for them and maybe do evaluation activities at those events. So it was kind of seeing how I didn't have to add a burden or an extra layer of stress onto the organization, but really fit into what was already happening and amplify their existing organizing. Third, inclusivity was really important to us. So making sure that anytime we did engage people, it was as inclusive as possible. So for example, everything was stipended, which is a common practice for the SROC and other similar organizations. Otherwise, it can just be too much of a barrier for some tenants to come out and give 2 or 3 hours of their time to a project like this. And also a lot of folks don't have access to phones or computers. So really making sure that all of our promotional materials were accessible and delivered to the doors of people where relevant. So those kinds of things. And then finally, I'll just share some light on the idea of reflection. I think it's a theme that came up quite a bit throughout the past year, especially from staff actually, but also tenants, is that there's often not enough space and time and resources carved out for reflection within an organization doing this kind of work. It's just the reality is that there's so much to do, and there's a lot of urgency, and there's a lot of on the ground organizing that has to happen. So having an evaluator, an external evaluator like myself, come in and help provide that space for safer reflecting and learning together proved to be really helpful for staff and tenants. Of course, we always reflect all the time, but having like a really set space where you get to do that on a regular basis can be really helpful. So that was some of the things guiding us throughout the past year. And in terms of actual data collection methods, like we said, regular meetings of the Tenant Evaluation Committee, as well as 24 interviews.
Picking up Momoy, right?
I think that was just unmute, right? Okay. If you have a question, let us know. 24 interviews with staff, tenants, and partners, including some funders, and then 40 building surveys, so individual surveys that went out to tenants in their buildings. That was led, all of the activities I'll say from the evaluation were peer-led, right? So that would be tenants, lead tenants doing this to neighbors in their buildings for the surveys. And then we had finally 4 focus groups, and those again were led by lead tenants who invited tenants in their buildings to come to a safe space to have a conversation about the program and how it was going. I think we ended up having about 30 participants in total for those 4 focus groups. So those are the methods. And now I'll just share a bit about the findings. We of course don't have time to get into the details of this today, but if you're curious, feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk more. Most of the findings we put into a really big report, and that was really helpful for us to document the work, and so the SROC could use that in their future work. And that was also helpful for funders. But also recognizing that the tenants are a big part of this, we've also hosted a series of events and created a series of simple 1-page information pamphlets about the findings as well. So this is just going to be a snippet of some of those things that were in that report. So I've grouped them into 3 sort of sections here. The first will be some impacts that the program is having. The second will be how the program is operating, which was a really big piece of what we found that was helpful. And then third, how is the program perceived by community partners and funders? So first, what impacts is the program having? So on the top there, we just have some statistics, some numbers, if that's helpful. So far, or I guess I should say at this moment in time, the program has 65 tenant workers. So that's stipended tenant volunteers that are leaders in their buildings and that do some of these tenant-based initiatives and other organizing. The number is definitely higher in terms of how many have actually been a part of the program, but at this current moment in time, there's 65. 7,579 was the number of hours that Bolt's peer tenant workers have spent doing maintenance and housekeeping work for their buildings and for their neighbors, which is pretty incredible. I think all of them were quite shocked to learn that had been that many altogether. Over 2,300 food deliveries to SRO buildings. So again, that's not the number of meals, that's actually the number of total deliveries. So the number of actual meals provided is much, much larger than that. And that's just in the span of 2.5 years. And then 28 SRO degree graduates. So Brian talked briefly about this. The degree program educates tenants on their rights as a tenant and other things like how to liaise with the landlord, et cetera. So 28 graduates. And then 9 barbecues hosted by outreach organizers. So those are the folks that Brian works with to help mobilize in their buildings. So they hosted 9 barbecues, inviting their neighbors out to do as a mobilizing sort of event. So in terms of some impacts, more qualitatively speaking, a few themes from the evaluation that I found were decreased isolation was a huge one, probably the top theme. Almost every tenant that I spoke to said that they felt less isolated having been a part of this program. Another theme was increased feelings of confidence, safety, and overall well-being, both in a physical sense and an emotional and mental sense as well. Third theme was increased connectedness between tenants. So these barbecues, these meetings, the tenant-based initiatives was absolutely having this effect of creating this sense of solidarity and this network between tenants, especially in their buildings, but also between buildings as well. And then finally, increased visibility of SRO tenants, whether that was through media, so more media coverage of tenants, through the policy process, like we spoke about, and also through funding access was a big theme as well. So in terms of how the program operates, for any of those people in the audience that do evaluation, you probably know that a big part of evaluation is actually just helping an organization understand how it works. Sometimes that's a big part of it. So in this one, I helped create some tools and graphics to sort of understand how the initiatives were working and how the programs were working together. So a few, two key things that I want to share that were really interesting was that the tenant-based initiatives, which Brian described, really were providing this network and structure for broader tenant decision-making and increased tenant power. So it was, it starts out with just a housekeeping connection maybe between tenants, but having multiple of these things happening within the building at any given week was creating this connectedness between tenants that was key for organizing for larger issues. So whether that was an emergency, whether that was COVID, a fire in the building, or vacancy control bylaw, the SROC was developing this kind of ground movement of people that were connected to each other, knew each other's numbers, knew who was vulnerable in the building, and were able to quite quickly mobilize in more intense situations, which was incredible. And then the second one is that the SROC really does act as a liaison between tenants, government actors, and community partners, which I've spoken to a bit before. But that was a really key finding about how it was operating. And then the third sort of group of findings was how the program is perceived by community partners and funders. I could speak to this, but I thought it'd be more fun to just show you a video. I'll explain the process behind these videos in the next few slides, but first let's take a look. It'll take a second to load here, but it should work.
Organizing has really helped in our work. The work that the SRO Collaborative does around tenant organizing is really incredible, and they really fill a gap as a connection point between the city as a funder, as a regulator, as a policymaker with the residents on the ground that are affected by these policies. So I think we really think of them as kind of the boots on the ground. If there's some suspected rent evictions happening, or there's an owner is thinking about selling a building, or there's a standard of maintenance issue, like an elevator isn't working, then they'll alert us to that, and then we can, take that information and work across departments and sometimes with the province or with other partners and take the appropriate course of action. So that's really helpful to us to kind of have that connection with what's happening.
Okay, so that was just a little taster, but hopefully that kind of nods to that last type of finding, which is really how the program is perceived by community partners and funders. And if you didn't see it, that was Monica Shuj, and she's a senior planner with the City of Vancouver. So let's see if this works. Okay, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. So at the end of the evaluation, first off, I just want to say that it was so wonderful working with Seabrit through the evaluation. Like she said, she really did an amazing job of adding to the work and not like taking anything from the work. She didn't put any burdens on us, and if anything, like being able to explain our processes to her was able for us to actually make them more concrete and to make them more just make us better at telling our own story. So the recommendations that we came to at the end, I worked with Seabrit so that these would directly flow into what our plans for the future would be, and really to help us kind of reinforce the learnings that we had done through the process. So we wanted to expand more opportunities for tenant involvement in decision making. So like Seabrit was saying, there is an informal kind of process developing in the buildings with the lead tenants taking on more decision making. So we'd like to create more processes and systems for that, and to expand on those decision making processes. And she created so many really awesome graphics and materials to explain the ideas of the hub program, and this has been really key for us to be able to onboard new tenants and really help tenants tell their own story as volunteers and as members of their tenant committees. We've also really want to try to make the tenants have more ownership of their roles and to increase their profiles in their buildings, and also be able to better explain what their roles are to their neighbors. So we had a photo day last week, and we're going to make little ID cards for the tenants to be able to show their neighbors, and just to kind of, again, further legitimize their roles. We have to do more work to integrate the different departments and different TDIs so that the staff are working more in lockstep as the tenants become more connected. We really would like to formalize the tenant committee structure. So maybe have membership cards, or we also are looking forward to having potential certifications of tenant committees that achieve 50% membership in their building. And we really want to include the tenants and their organizing in some more broader picture long-term goals, such as the land trusts, which Wendy's been talking about in the chat, and I'm sure we can get to in the question period.
Perfect. So that concludes sort of the evaluation, and now we'll just shift for the last 5 or 10 minutes to talk about the knowledge transfer process that followed the evaluation. Right, we have a second poll. Okay, Lee, do you want to pop that up when you get a second? Thank you. Perfect. Yeah, I just want to get a sense from the room of where people are at with the term knowledge transfer. So the first question is, how familiar are you with the term knowledge transfer? On a scale of 1 to 10. And then the second question is, how would you define knowledge transfer? Don't think too hard about it. Just give us a little one sentence. I'm curious to hear what people have to say. Oh yeah, I wonder, Lee, if is there a way to pop up the answers to question number 2 that people
I
submit?
think we will be able to show them when the poll ends, but I don't think we could show them while the poll is still open.
Okay, cool. Oh, this is interesting. Great. Okay, a nice smattering. No one has a PhD on knowledge transfer. That's good to know. I was worried I'd be talking to an expert. Cool. Okay, we've probably got most responses. Sure. Do you want to end it, Lee? Do we get to see the answers for number 2?
When I open it, I have an option to click through and show view details. I think everyone else should have that as well because we've shared the results, but let me know if not.
Okay, cool. I'm going to leave it for now and keep going on. But if people can see it, that's awesome. Feel free to take a look and see how people define it. It's great.
I'll put the answers in the chat as well, just
Oh,
in
great.
case folks can't see them.
That'd be awesome. Thanks, Lee. Great. Okay, well, good to know. I'm glad that there's a bit of a range, though. It's nice that some people have familiarity with this term and others less so. It's good to hear. So I'll get started with my little interpretation of the term. I say this because it's a bit of a funny term. It's used in many different contexts in different ways. So, this is my personal approach. So knowledge transfer, I think, is sharing knowledge from one group or person to another group or person. It's sort of just the act of synthesizing and distributing information about a topic for the purpose of improving practices among other actors. So I think actually when I looked into it, knowledge transfer is usually used to refer to knowledge between an organization, so from one department to another, to help improve understanding and communication and flow of information. But it also can be across different sectors, or across different people in a broader movement. So that's kind of how we're thinking of it here. We're thinking of the knowledge that we have at the SRO Collaborative and the knowledge that we've gained, especially through this evaluation process. Thinking of that as really valuable information that other actors should have access to, whether they're funding these kinds of things, whether they're other tenant organizers, or whether there are other nonprofits that are supporting these movements. So partly we realized that the evaluation was kind of internally focused, it was so specific and relevant to our particular community that we were working with. So we wanted to develop some tools that were a little bit broader and kind of gave a quick snapshot of the work that we had done, but also shared sort of the bigger picture of why this work is important and how one could get involved in this work in one's own community. So this was partly our process. So it was post-evaluation, like I said. The evaluation wrapped up after about a year. And then for the past few months, we've just been doing this knowledge transfer piece. The target audience, like I said, tenant organizing groups, funders, decision makers. And this was also in deep collaboration with the Community Housing Transformation Center. They were a key partner and funder of both the evaluation and the knowledge transfer, which was super helpful. So the first thing we did was develop an SRO Hub tenant organizing roadmap. So sort of like a simplified little roadmap with 7 steps on it that kind of loosely showed our process for developing this SRO Hub tenant-led organizing program. For that roadmap, each step had accompanying how-to documents. So how to do the first step, how to do the second step, etc. And each of those had an accompanying video. And you've just seen part of one of the videos with Monica. The second part of the knowledge transfer this is where it gets a bit meta, stick with me here, is what we're doing now. So the knowledge transfer is actually doing webinars. So for other folks that are doing similar work, like it is helpful to do a webinar, both for yourselves to then communicate that work. And so this doesn't just stay within your organization, it gets shared more broadly and we can help have more innovation and cross-pollination across the sector. So I'm going to just do a quick little run through of the roadmap and then we'll wrap up shortly after that. So this is what the roadmap looks like that I described. Those are the 7 steps and I'll just read them out. It's a bit too small. So the first was community organizing. The second is partnership development. The third is tenant leader identification. The fourth was tenant-based initiatives. The fifth is data collection. The 6th is tenant decision-making capacity. And the 7th was evaluation, of course. So just to give a little sense of what they look like, I'll just click on the how to. Oops. So this is one of the how-to documents. This is for the 4th step. So how to create tenant-based initiatives in your own community, for example. So we give a little description of what they are, some core concepts, and then we describe how we implemented that, because we do think that could be helpful for other people wanting to implement something similar, is to know about what was particular about our context that made it work the way that it did for us. And I'll just open up this video of a tenant talking about the tenant-based initiatives that he does in his building. We'll just watch a minute of it or so. They take a minute to load, bear with me.
Program, which I know personally a lot of people are very grateful for. Now, a lot of people that live here, they have depression issues, which might make it hard for them to get out of bed, maybe waiting in long lineups in soup kitchens and whatnot. So having this even 2 days a week is what we have. It makes people very happy, and they word it to me. They're always like, "Hey man, thank you. This is really good," and they appreciate it. I actually recruited another guy here to help me with that because it's a lot of work. I also teach classes about tenants' rights and 311 and on all these, how to fight back the landlord. And so a lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this, but I actually teach now just to people who live here, and that's pretty cool. The work that I do.
We won't have time for all of it, unfortunately, so I'm just going to shift back. But that gives you a snippet of, we have a video like this for each of the steps of the roadmap. So, and I see we're getting close to time here, so I'll wrap up shortly. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think that it was really, really important for us to be able to be a part of this knowledge transfer process, because it can be very isolating to do this work. As Kristen was saying, we don't really know if other people are doing similar work to us, and it would be really interesting to reach out to other groups or inspire other groups so that we could share best practices or develop new ways of going about this work. And Seabrit's also been really amazing at providing opportunities for tenants to also be involved in the knowledge transfer process. She really demystified the whole evaluation process and had tenants at every single step of the way. And we even had 2 tenants participate in the last webinar that we put on about organizing. So yeah, it's been a very, very excellent process.
And that's it. Thank you so much for paying attention this whole way. I had initially had some other questions that I could ask folks in the 3rd poll, but we're getting close to time. So maybe let's just take a pause and yeah, say thank you and welcome any questions or discussion that people might have. Okay, see you later, Wendy. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to just chime in with your voice.
I'll just jump in and say hello. Hello. I'm here joining you from Toronto downtown, and we have supportive housing here. We have lots of shelters that have moved into hotels during COVID, but the supportive housing is, it seems like, where people will be ending up eventually after the shelters. Supposedly that's the pathway, and yet not as old buildings, with bachelor apartments with bathrooms, kitchens, but definitely the maintenance issues where tenants know they're not at risk of losing their losing their tenancy if they make complaints of very poor maintenance neglect, but they definitely are worn out and frustrated because the maintenance doesn't happen, leadership doesn't listen, they don't have the dignity that they should be living with, and that ongoing, homelessness, oppression continues in largely the population that's coping harmfully rather than some great built-in empowerment like you have going on. So I really hope that we can learn so much. Like, I really hope that we can adapt some of these things and continue to work together. Well, here in Toronto, because we really do want to make change happen through peer-led organizing and peer support, definitely. But you're just an inspiration. So I bet you are unique and, across Canada, I wonder, right? But so inspiring. Thank you so much for, yes, the excellent tools you shared and all of this amazing initiative that's just like doing what we all hope will happen everywhere, including in supportive housing. Thank you.
No, and I think, Elizabeth, you really hit the nail on the head, because when tenants make demands of their landlord, we see that is that them giving their landlord their power. You're literally handing over your power when you make those demands, because then you're waiting for the landlord to respond, and the landlord gets to control the response. Where a lot of our initiatives, we will go in, and if a tenant has a broken thing in their room, we might just fix it, even if the landlord is supposed to do it, because that kind of direct action gives the tenants dignity, and they get to choose how it's done, and they have control over the process.
Yeah, that taking back control is an incredible piece. So great.
Thanks so much for your comments, Elizabeth. It's really wonderful to hear. I know Tristan's in Toronto right now, so if you can jump in, Tristan, if you want to share anything.
Yeah, I'm in downtown Toronto. Yeah, that's a great point, and we organize in privately owned buildings, not in supportive housing, and so there's more innovations needed. You have to think through how to do that. It's a different dynamic. We should talk later.
Yeah. Well, I think another angle to that is that the private landlords are smaller. Like we're not dealing with a monopoly. Whereas with the supportive housing, or when you're going against BC housing, you're dealing with a giant monopolized housing sector, which is harder to gain leverage if the goal is negotiation. Whereas private landlords, which are divided, you can pit them against each other, or you can gain leverage in more creative ways because they aren't so monolithic.
I recognize we're over time, so we'll wrap up here. Don't want to take too much of people's day, but thank you so much. There's so much more we could chat about. Hopefully you have a sense of how to get a hold of us if you're curious. Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for putting your email there. You can find us online, look for Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative, and we'd love to hear from you and be in touch. Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.